The fact that we keep raising the ceiling guarantees a debt crisis, because the only thing that's going to put a stop to the debt is a crisis.
In today's video, Peter Schiff, founder, CEO and global strategist of Euro-Pacific Capital, gives a warning that the 2008 crisis was just the prelude to a larger sovereign debt crisis in the United States that may lead to a collapse of the US dollar.
I want to know your expectation for that conflict in Congress when it comes to having to raise the debt ceiling again from 34.1 trillion to whatever comes next.
Well, again, remember, the problem is the debt. It's not the ceiling. In fact, the ceiling is actually part of the solution. The problem is they keep raising the ceiling every time we approach it or hit it, as opposed to doing something to stay within the ceiling. That was the whole purpose of the debt ceiling, which actually started back in 1917, coinciding with America's entry into the First World War and the fact that we were borrowing a lot of money. And so Congress wanted to put some kind of cap on how much money the government could borrow. And the problem is, we keep raising the ceiling. And so it's not really achieving its intended purpose, which was to put some limit on how much debt we could accumulate. But every time we get to the ceiling, though, we just get all this political theater where the Republicans pretend they actually want to cut spending, but they don't actually propose any significant spending cuts. And of course, the Democrats don't want to cut any spending. Nobody wants to raise taxes, at least not on the middle class, which is where all the money is. And so the debt ceiling always gets raised. This is all political posturing. This is throwing meat to your base. But at the end of the day, the politicians will come together and once again do the wrong thing and raise the debt ceiling. In contrast to what they claim, this is not about paying our bills. If we were going to pay our bills, we would pay them and not raise the debt ceiling. This is about continuing to not pay our bills. Instead of paying our bills, we borrow the money. And we can't continue to avoid paying our bills unless we raise the debt ceiling. So that's what it's about. It's not about doing the responsible thing. It's about continuing to do the reckless and irresponsible thing.
Is it all just media theater, political theater as we lead up to this? And there's really only one outcome that, okay.
The reason we've got 32 trillion in debt is because we keep raising the debt ceiling.
Yeah.
And, the Democrats now, since they're the ones that want a clean raise, and the Republicans are, pretending that they want to do something. But of course, they had a chance to do something when Trump was president, and they had the House and the Senate, and they just voted to raise the debt ceiling back then, when they actually could have maybe done something, and they didn't take advantage of the opportunity. So now it's all BS that they're, claiming they want to do something now, when they know they have a president of the opposite party. This is not the time. The time to do something was 4 years ago, and they did nothing. But the Democrats are saying, hey, if we don't raise this debt ceiling, it's a disaster. Interest rates are going to rise. Everybody's going to suffer. That is what's going to happen if we do raise the debt ceiling. See, all the bad things that they say are going to happen if we don't raise it are going to happen because we have been raising it. The fact that we keep raising the ceiling guarantees a debt crisis, because the only thing that's going to put a stop to the debt is a crisis. And so we've chosen to have a crisis on the market's terms instead of trying to manage something less horrific on our own terms.
What is the role of the US dollar as the reserve currency of the world? And, because everything's relative. So if US dollars are being inflated into oblivion relative to what other currencies, and how do they perform?
Yeah, well, the US dollar has done substantial damage to the global economy because it was the reserve. I mean, we have basically exported our inflation all around the world, and the world has suffered from this relationship. America has gained at the expense of everybody else. And, it's not that everybody has suffered equally. I think the emerging markets have borne the lion's share of the burden of subsidizing American profligacy. But we've basically just shot ourselves in the foot, to accelerate the process by weaponizing the dollar. I think President Biden put the nail in that coffin when he put those sanctions on Russia. And so everything has now been accelerated. In the long run, this is going to be good for the United States. I mean, the sooner we lose this privilege, the quicker we can start, creating a viable economy because we were going to lose it eventually. Certainly for the rest of the world, it's better, right? The sooner they could stop subsidizing America, the better. Because America's loss is going to be the world's gain. When the dollar crashes, and it will crash, that means other currencies are rising. Now, what does that mean? That means as Americans get poorer, everybody else gets richer. And so Americans consume less and everybody else consumes more. All the stuff that Americans used to buy will be too expensive for Americans to afford. But that stuff is still going to be here. The factories aren't going to start producing it just because Americans stop consuming it. So what's going to happen is people in other countries are going to get to buy what the Americans can no longer afford. See, they're not buying it right now because the Americans are outbidding them. So all this is going to change, and it's, a big loss for the US and a gain for the rest of the world.
Broadly speaking, is that not a massively deflationary event if the world's largest consumer is dramatically compromised?
No, because other consumers are going to pick up that slack. Remember, it's just a transfer of consumption. Americans consume less, the Chinese consume more, right? Simple as that. Right? So net consumption isn't going down. It's just, where does the consumption take place? Who gets to do the consuming? Right? Because if Americans want to consume, they're going to have to pay much higher prices to do it. That's why Americans are going to consume so much less, because they're not going to have the money, right? They're not going to have the purchasing power to do it.
What's your take, broad strokes, on the de-dollarization of key economies around the world?
Well, I don't think anybody's really dumping dollars yet. I think they're slowly divesting. I don't think it's a rush for the exit yet. I think that's ultimately going to happen. And when that does happen, the dollar's exchange rate is going to be deteriorating at a far more rapid pace. I mean, so far the decline from the peak of around 115 to where we are now around 101, that's been very slow and steady and orderly. And I think that it will continue to be slow and steady, maybe until the dollar index gets around 80 or maybe 70. But once it cracks below that level, I expect the pace to really accelerate and potentially into an outright crash in the dollar. But the fact that so many in the media are now waking up to this and covering it, I mean, it really must be happening now that it's even being talked about. I mean, I've been talking about it for a long time, that it was inevitable, that it was an inevitability this would happen. But nobody really talked about it. They just thought that it was inevitable that the dollar would be the reserve currency indefinitely. Now you're finally starting to see some acknowledgement that that might not be the case, but I still don't think the mainstream really understands the significance of what this means and how life in America will change so profoundly if the dollar's, or when the dollar's reserve currency status is lost. I was reading just an article today. Druckenmiller was talking about his highest conviction trade, the trade that he's most confident is going to work out, and that's short the dollar. I agree. I mean, my entire investment thesis for 20 years really has been get out of the dollar. I mean, I was very early in understanding ultimately where the dollar was headed. So if I'm right and the dollar does lose this status and it collapses, whether it crashes, by 90% or more, or just gets cut in half, I am positioned to make a lot of dollars. So I'll have a lot more of them. Of course, they won't be worth as much, but I'll have hopefully enough of them that, the quantity will compensate for the quality. But okay. I own all these foreign assets. And actually, they're not really dollars. What I own is assets in foreign countries. We can just price them in dollars. And as the dollar loses value, the price in dollars goes way up. But the underlying assets are still in foreign currencies, or they represent the assets of the businesses. But I also own stock in a lot of companies that are in areas that will benefit a lot from inflation. Raw materials, natural resources. And of course, I have huge over concentration personally in gold and silver mining stocks. And a lot of these stocks, I think, are going to go up not only 10x, some of them 50 or 100x. And I have sizable positions in these stocks, 7-figure positions. So, you 50x those, right? I mean, that's, so I'm in a position, I think, to make a lot of money on this short dollar trade as it emerges. I think most people are on the wrong side of this trade. They just think the dollar is going to reign supreme indefinitely. They just don't see any viable challengers to the dollar's throne. And in a way, I agree. I don't think the euro or the yen or the RMB or the pound or any of these currencies is going to replace the dollar. I think gold is going to replace the dollar. I mean, the dollar replaced gold. We're just going to go back to the way it was. And in fact, the only reason that the dollar became the reserve currency was because it was not only backed by gold, but redeemable in gold. The dollar was as good as gold, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but for gold, the dollar wouldn't have been the reserve currency. And it was only the reserve currency also because we were the world's biggest creditor nation. We had the largest trade surpluses. Today, it's the opposite. World's biggest debtor nation. In fact, we owe more than all the other debtor nations of the world combined. Massive trade deficit, and the dollar's backed by nothing. And we keep on printing them. We have multi-trillion-dollar budget deficits as far as the eye can see, completely reckless and irresponsible politicians, no discipline whatsoever, massive inflation. There's no way that the dollar could qualify for the reserve currency. I mean, if it wasn't the reserve currency now, it never would qualify. But the weaponization of the dollar has now accelerated that trend, and it's over, right? It's already happening. It's just that so many people are still blind to what's obvious.